Farms in Wisconsin kind of looked like. Well, at least this is the farms that we wanted to call on. Not all of them were that nice and neat, but basically farms would milk about 50 to 60 cows in a tie stall barn. They have upright silos for feeding, and basically the technology of data collection is that we walk into the milk house and see how much milk was shipped that day. And that was the extent of it. But I will tell you that when I started making farm calls, my first year in 1986, when you go out to a farm like this, there's 3 topics that farmers wanted to talk about, almost every farm. The first topic was milk price. Everybody wanted to talk about milk price. We're not getting enough for our milk price. Number 2 was, of course, the weather. The weather is either good, bad, or it's usually something's going on. And then without a doubt, people are always talking about down cows. The farmer would look at me and say, hey, I had another fresh cow that was down. And they would say, your mineral's no good. Or if we weren't feeding our mineral, can you have a mineral that would help fix our down cow problems? So back then, that was the 3 common topics. So if you fast forward to 2022 today, now here's what the farms look like in the Midwest, where my work primarily is now, instead of 50 to 60 cow dairies, we have 1,000 to 2,000 cow dairies. Much higher milk production, much higher components. But when I walk out to the farm today or tomorrow or yesterday, there's 3 topics they talk about. Number 1 is the milk price. Can we get more for our product? Number 2 is the weather. Always complaining about the weather. And 3 is maybe not so much down cows, but certainly hypocalcemia and fresh cow issues that kind of come with hypocalcemia. Hypocalcemia is kind of a gateway disease. So this is 35 plus years. We've been talking about hypocalcemia for 35 plus years in my career. And basically, it's not from the lack of information that's come out. There's been tons of information. And this is just an example of headlines you see in the popular press. So for the last 35 years, I've gone to conferences. I've read popular press magazines. You go to research functions. Everybody talks about how can we fix transition cows. And basically it's one group dry cow, bunk space, but there's really there's hundreds of these kind of articles the last 35 years trying to figure out how can we fix hypocalcemia. But there's 2 articles that kind of came out in the early 2000s. One was the biology of the dairy cows during the transition period, the final frontier. And that was written by Jim Drakely, talking about if we can get the transition cows figured out, we're going to really have a better profitability for dairy farms. And so that was back in the early 2000s, and we're still aren't quite there yet. And then there's another article that came out, I think it was Tom Overton at Cornell, The Good, the Bad, and How It Gets Ugly. And I've seen some ugly situations with transition cows, trying to figure it out. Now, it's not all due to nutrition. A lot of it's due to environment management. We have a lot to learn here. But my point here is we've been looking at hypocalcemia for the past 35 years. It's not from a lack of information that's out there. We still got things to learn, a few things to figure out. So basically, a lot of people have seen this, that hypocalcemia is the gateway disease, that if a cow comes in with low blood calcium, she's more likely to have problems. And they also talk about clinical versus subclinical. Clinical is kind of just the tip of the iceberg. Clinical means cows that are actually down that you can visually see. But there's a lot of cows below the top tip of the iceberg that have hypocalcemia. And how can we improve the calcium status of fresh cows? Well, we've tried a lot of things over the last 35 plus years. Certainly, negative DCAD balancing has had a stronghold in this area. We've been trying a lot of different strategies when it comes to negative DCAD balancing. In a research setting, negative DCAD balancing works actually, I think, pretty good. When we get out in the real world, DCAD balancing has some challenges. If you get your ducks in a row and get the boxes checked, it can work okay. We've also seen people go to one-group dry cow programs. That is, they couldn't mix a pre-fresh TMR mix because they didn't have enough cows. They couldn't mix a big enough batch to get a good quality control of the mix. So they just said, heck, we'll just do a one-group dry cow and feed the same thing all the way through. And basically that works pretty good. It kind of minimizes all the different small batch sizes and the ration changes. So people have tried that in smaller herd sizes. A lot of people, when they go one group dry cow, they try to keep that calcium level low and the potassium level low. And quite frankly, for the last 35 years, people have tried a combination of all of these, okay? Every farm is different, and we tried a lot of different things. Some results have been okay, some results have been mixed. And I guess inconsistent results would be, I think it'd be a very fair statement to say here, because some of these programs are real tough to manage out on farms. And the reason they're tough to manage, it's hard to source, in some cases, it's hard to source low potassium and low calcium forages. The forages in the Midwest and the United States and Wisconsin are really quite high in potassium, and in order to make decad balancing work, we really want to have lower potassium forages. And then TMR quality control, you can have the best looking ration on paper, but if you don't get it mixed right and there's a consistent mix and every bite that a cow takes is the same every time, you can have some challenges with TMR quality control. One thing that I see a lot on some of these big dairies, we got 30,000 pound mixers or 14,000 kilogram mixers, and they're trying to mix a small batch in there, and it's hard to get that consistency. Urine pH testing and calcium boluses are used quite a bit. Urine pH testing should really be used to monitor your decad program, and some farms do it pretty regularly. Some people don't do it at all. And we also got to really talk about, in this business, a lot of emphasis goes towards fix the nutrition and we fix everything. Well, nutrition's important, but the environment's important, and the human element, how we manage all this, is really important. And you got to tie all these, the nutrition, the environment, and the management all together. But even though we've tried a lot of different things, we still see a high incidence of hypocalcemia today. Okay. Basically, if you use 8.5 as our cut point, we want cows above 8.5 when they calve. There's still 60 to 80% of fresh cows that are below that cut point. We want it higher to have the better transition success. And so one thing I'd like to point out, though, is that this is kind of a management thing as far as the involving fundamentals of management. We can kind of get the ration correct and get things dialed in pretty good, but you still got to have these fundamentals in place. There's a lot of farms that don't have their bunk space correct, and we've learned that if you get better bunk space, you get better cow comfort, you minimize the stocking densities, minimize the pen moves. You want to make sure you feed a high fiber TMR to get the good gut fill. And then you got to have fresh cow protocols so you know how to manage some of those cows when they come in. But even with all those things that we made great improvements on in the management, we still see high percent of hypocalcemia, and that's my point to today. Is we've done a lot of work, both management and nutrition, but we still see a high prevalence of hypocalcemia. And this goes back, even though it's 10 years old, the USDA in the United States did a study, a survey of 1,462 cows, 480 herds. Blood was collected within 48 hours of calving. About 50% were below 8, okay? And if we use a cut point of 8.5 today, that's about 60 to 80% of the cows are below 8.5. And that's kind of our goal, to get higher blood calcium status. So my bottom line is this: we've been involved in this business for a long time, even with ongoing research and a lot of improved or more research in negative decad strategies and better management strategies. We still see a very high prevalence of subclinical hypocalcemia. I think it's really important to understand that as we move forward, that's kind of the past. As we move forward, experiences really shape our advances. And when I talk about experiences, I talk about research. I talk about research experience. What can we learn from research? What we can learn from science? And what we can learn from the farm level? And more importantly, what do we learn from the cow? I got a saying that I use out on farms is that the cow is always right. Okay? And a lot of times nutritionists, consultants I've been out on farms with, they say, the producer says, well, we got this going on. And the consultant says, well, that's not what's supposed to happen. I go, I know that's not what's supposed to happen. That's what's happening. Okay? You got to listen to the cow. You got to listen to the producer, and you got to listen to the science. So we've been working with a strategy here in the States for the last 3.5 years where basically we got more research to do, but it certainly looks like when we minimize and restrict dietary phosphorus, we see a positive response on hypocalcemia. And this is counterintuitive of what we've all learned. And it took me a while to get my head around this because we've had potassium baked into our brain, low calcium diets baked into our brain, but there is something going on here with dietary phosphorus and restricting it. So these are blood samples that I've taken on a number of different farms out in the state of Wisconsin and the Midwest. This green area here is 8.5. We want to have the blood calcium in this range at calving. And this is one herd, a 5,000 cow crossbred herd that we started using here. And we saw a really nice jump of 8.93 average milligrams per deciliter. And if you look at millimolars per liter, that's more like 2.2, 2.3, somewhere in there. So it's really, really good. Some other farms that I did averaged about 8.6. And one thing I really want to point out here, this gold bar here is the University of Cornell data, and that's about 8.7. What's really neat about this is that the research, university research, agrees what we're seeing out in the farm, okay? So basically, we see nice responses out on the real world, and we saw a good response in the research too. Other programs, whether it's low potassium or DCAD, we typically see 7.5. So we see a nice jump in there. Oops. So, but one thing I want to show here, this is why I want to talk about this phosphorus. When we feed this binding strategy, we have lower blood phosphorus. The blood phosphorus normally is here, but it's down here. It's low. And we're trying to understand how this mechanism works, and we think we got a pretty good idea now. But if you don't feed a binding strategy, we have normal blood phosphorus. And a lot of people ask about, does it bind things like magnesium? Does it bind anything like other minerals like magnesium or anything like that? And it really doesn't. So magnesium is fine. So we really want to focus on this. There's a relationship between lower blood phosphorus and higher blood calcium. That's the take-home point today. And actually, there's research out there. What I showed you before was on-farm research plus Cornell. Dr. Grunberg here in Hanover just put a paper out in 2022 that shows there's two treatments here. This is the low phosphorus treatment. This is the high phosphorus treatment. And when you feed a low phosphorus to the pre-fresh cows, we see higher blood calciums. And let me kind of show you that here. He restricted dietary phosphorus in the pre-fresh group, and we saw higher blood calciums. He fed higher phosphorus in the pre-fresh group, and we saw lower blood calciums. There is a connection here between phosphorus in the pre-fresh cows and blood calcium levels. One thing I like to kind of mention here is when I first got trained back in the 80s in trying to prevent hypocalcemia and milk fever, we all basically focused on, and that was back in the 80s, we basically focused on calcium. Feed a low calcium diet to try to get better blood calcium. Okay? And then the 90s comes along, And we figured out that, well, maybe potassium plays a bigger role, and it does. High potassium diets causes milk fever. But you also got to look at magnesium. Both potassium and magnesium played a role. So we went from the calcium to the potassium and magnesium. In the 2000s, we started looking at sodium, potassium, chloride, and sulfur. We're doing the negative decad strategy. In the decade of the 2010s, we still did the decad, but then we started feeding high calcium diets. So it's kind of funny, we go from low calcium diets to high calcium diets with negative decad. And then here we are in 2020. And basically, we're talking about phosphorus. So there's 7 macrominerals that are necessary to be balanced for a dairy cow's diet. These macrominerals are required in human nutrition too. Calcium, magnesium, it's supposed to be potassium, magnesium. It's off a little bit there. But we've talked about 6 other macrominerals for the last 35 years. We've overlooked phosphorus, and phosphorus may turn out to be just as important, if not more important, in pre-fresh feeding to minimize hypocalcemia. So that's my point, is that we've gone through the whole years of looking at these macrominerals, and phosphorus has been overlooked. So I'm going to skip that one. We got a strategy. But I also want to, as a consultant, you also want to make sure you look at the big picture. My experience is when things go really good on a farm, when you're consulting for a farm, when things go really good, the nutritionist gets too much credit. When things go really bad, the nutritionist gets too much blame. It's somewhere in between there. And you got to understand that there's a lot of risk, transitional risk out in farms. There's challenges out in farms. No farm's perfect. There's individual cow risk, and there's whole herd risk. And when you have problems in transition cows, it's usually not one factor that causes cows to have ketosis or RPs or milk fevers. It's usually a combination of a lot of them. So from an individual cow risk standpoint, you may have some cows that come in that are older, that got over body condition, and then all of a sudden we got a particle size and moisture consistency challenge. And because of that, I mean, we also got some overcrowding going on, and that's when you really see some challenges, when you get a combination of a lot of these things going on at the same time. So I just want to make sure you understand that. So my take-home messages for today, I learned pretty fast in this business that going out troubleshooting on farms or consulting on farms is a big puzzle. You're trying to put the pieces together. There are a lot of moving parts, and I can't emphasize enough that nutrition is important, but so is the environment, the management, and try to tie it all together. And from a nutritional standpoint, we've been working with dietary mineral manipulation, binding some phosphorus. By doing that, we're minimizing hypocalcemia. It's so important to prepare the fresh cow for the high calcium demand. Colostrum, the calcium content of colostrum has double the calcium content in regular milk. And the cow really needs to pull a lot of calcium out of the bones to meet that demand. Again, that's off. That should be over there. We really want to focus on phosphorus, and phosphorus, what I mean by that, less is more. Okay? I just thought I'd throw one last point here. Key areas for continued future research, colostrum. We get a lot of questions in transition cows about colostrum production. I'm not sure what it's like over in this part of the world, but we definitely have some challenges no matter what kind of program we're using on colostrum synthesis and production. And there's a lot of work on antioxidants, inflammation, immunity, trying to understand that, and then certainly welfare, longevity, productive life. So that's my little spiel for today. I appreciate your attention, and thank you.